Hello, I am Eli Adashi, Professor of Medical Science at Brown University and author of the paper Clomiphene Citrate at 50, The Dawning of Assisted Reproduction. My own first paper on clomiphene citrate was published in 1979 in Fertility and Sterility. The focus was the gestational outcomes of ovulation induction with the drug. In the subsequent 3 years, we published 3 additional papers on more basic aspects. The real story, however, begins in 1967 when clomiphene citrate was approved by the FDA for the purpose of inducing ovulation in women who were otherwise anovulatory and therefore infertile. In hindsight, this was a breakthrough by any measure. At the time, in general, there was very little one could offer infertile couples who were seeking to build a family. There was certainly nothing of consequence that could be offered to women who were anovulatory and who presented with that challenge to the clinic. To physicians who care for patients with infertility, clomiphene citrate was literally a panacea at the time. There was simply nothing quite like it up to that point. The drug itself was synthesized in 1956 by Frank Palapali, who was a chemist with William S. Merrill Company in Cincinnati. Frank Palapali regrettably passed away last year. His obituary was carried by the New York Times. He was 94 at the time. He was the son of Italian immigrants, Pittsburgh born and raised, whose father was a steelworker. An American dream, if there ever was one. The company considered multiple applications. Ovulation induction was one of them, but contraception was also on the table, as was the possibility of using clomiphene to antagonize estrogen-dependent endometrial hyperplasia or even breast cancer. Ultimately, the successful studies focused on ovulation induction and began with a series of consultations in 1960 at the annual meeting of a predecessor society to the American Society for Reproductive Medicine. It was only a year later when Dr. Robert Greenblatt from the Medical College of Georgia in Augusta, Georgia, reported on the pages of JAMA the successful induction of ovulation in a substantial number of patients who presented with a polycystic ovary syndrome. Several of them were in fact successful in conceiving. Many others resumed normal ovulatory function while on the drug. The final point I will make is that if there was ever a downside to clomiphene citrate, it was, of course, its propensity to bring about multiple birth. And clomiphene is, by definition, a contributor to the so-called multiple birth epidemic we are all contending with. It falls largely under the category of non-IVF induced multiple birth, about which we have relatively little hard data, but we know that the multiple births that are attributable to non-IVF technologies unfortunately continue to plague us, whereas IVF-driven multiple births are on the decline. One way or the other, this is a remarkably important story that is useful to reiterate on this important occasion that is the 50th anniversary of this drug.